Hello, everyone, and welcome to my cartoons ranking tier list of the year. There's a bit more to this one, like I was saying in the last list, if you watched that. But I need to make some adjustments first before we begin, because some of these just don't look right to me. So one of the things I did is I rewatched Steven Universe this year, and it's a good show still. I believe that. I think because this encompasses future and stuff, I'm not going to move it, but I just wanted to say that I actually have rewatched it now more recently, and yeah, I agree with that placement in low A. I do think I overrated Scooby-Doo a little bit. It's a good show, but like looking at these two, I feel like they're both better. And then I think that's mostly okay. I just want to move this down to here. And I want to move this up to here. So Brand New Animal, I think most of the show is actually good. It's really just the ending that ruins it for me. So, you know, it's kind of on the level of these shows where they've got lots of good stuff in them, but just some of it doesn't work very well at all. And then these two I'm leaving in D tier because I feel like they're adaptations. I think adaptations have a tough time in this list, apparently. They're adaptations of manga or a previous show, right? And they screw it up really badly. So I'll leave them in D. And this is an adaptation of an animated show that has good stuff in it. But, and if you didn't see, about halfway through the year I made a video where I talked about the Avatar live action remake and my thoughts on it, as well as Ranma and Danny Phantom, because those were the two shows I had watched at that point in the year. The thing about Avatar is even its good stuff, like everybody brings up the scene of Iroh and Zuko at Lu Ten's funeral, which is a great scene, but in the context of taking this show as its own thing, it still doesn't work. Because we don't care about Iroh or Zuko if we've only watched the live action, right? They've barely done anything. And the things that they have done have been directly, like, you know, villainous acts against our heroes, I guess you could say. So, like, that would be, like, if that was the first thing we saw of Zuko's sympathetic side in the cartoon, which would be crazy. It, like, speed runs right to the end of his character arc. So yeah, I feel like the show, I feel bad putting it on the same tier as these, because there are things about these shows that I still like. There's almost nothing about the show that I think works, unfortunately. I know people like this show, and that's perfectly fine. I want to make that clear. You can like anything that's on this list that I criticize or whatever. But comparing it as an adaptation or having it as a standalone, I feel like it doesn't work. You have to, like, kind of, like, cherry pick, if I had to put it one way. Like, you have to be like, oh, yeah, well, this works because of the way I feel about Avatar already, but it's its own thing, so I shouldn't compare it to Avatar, you know? Anyway, we got new shows to talk about. These are all the shows I watched this year. It's a little bit of a heavier year than usual because me and my sister are doing, like, a watch party thing now with certain shows. So some of these were her picks for us to watch, and some of them were mine. Although most of the ones that I picked are already on the list, so... Anyway, we're going to start with Curses. This is an Apple TV show that we just ended up watching because it looked interesting. However, this show definitely gets kneecapped by either Apple or DreamWorks. This is a DreamWorks television show, by the way. Because its premise is essentially that it's about the kids of a famous explorer, like an Indiana Jones type, who took a bunch of artifacts from places, and now they have to go return the artifacts to where they belong to stop a bunch of curses from happening, which is a kind of fun premise, right? But I feel like the show isn't allowed to go as far as the people behind it want to. Like, for example, in the first episode, well, okay, it's not the first episode, but with the first artifact, they bring it back to the place it's at, and it stops these evil monkey spirits from destroying this place. okay, that makes sense. That's good for an introductory thing. But then in the second episode, it's like a crying stone baby. And instead of taking it back to where it's supposed to be, they take it back to its mother who's in a museum. But there's like no discussion about the museum keeping the artifact. Like, they're just going to keep it. It's just like, if the whole idea is that wouldn't the Aztec temple where it came from still be cursed? Like, anyway. It's flawed for sure. So I'm going to put it at the... Actually, I'll probably put it like here. It's a interesting watch. I also feel like the pacing is very bizarre in a lot of these episodes where not like they'll do like the same sort of chase scene like 3 times. It's a low budget TV show. What can I say? Next up is Lego Monkey Kid, which I believe, at least from the way it is animated for the first 3 seasons anyway, or 4, I don't remember, is made by the same people who did Rise of the TMNT. And if you know anything about that show, it has breakneck action that is honestly too much for me to follow with my old brain. I know that sounds like a stupid complaint if you have young brain, but it's true. Okay? It's real. And my other biggest problem with the show is that you can see in this picture there's like a group of characters here. Only 2 of them actually matter, which feels very antithetical to what it's based on, which is Journey to the West. It's just about a group of characters traveling on a journey, right? And Monkey King, who's the most popular character out of it, is definitely probably the most important, but also just one of the characters in the cast. In this one, it really feels like Monkey Kid, who's the main character and has Monkey King's powers, is really the only one that actually matters. And then the female lead, May, kind of matters occasionally. And then the other 3 are just like there, which is very common in these shows. But, it was pitched to me as like, this is the best Monkey King adaptation. Which, like, I guess there's some cool stuff about it. It's perfectly fine. It's just nothing special, probably. So I'm going to put it here. All right, Ranma Half remake. So if you'll remember last year, we had the Urusei Yatsura remake situation where I was like, it abridges the original, which kind of misses the point because the original wasn't really about like an overarching story. It was kind of just like a Looney Tunes comedy show. So by abridging it and toning down a lot of the comedy, it really is to the show's detriment, even though it looks very good and there are scenes that still are very nice. You skip over all the important stuff, right? The character building stuff between the audience and the characters, where you come to understand them. This remake, however, is not doing that. And oh, that helps it so much. Now, I don't want to rank it too highly yet, because there's only 12 episodes right now, and they haven't introduced a lot of the most annoying characters that really made me start to dislike Ranma as it went on. If you've watched my original review in that video, it's called Things Keep Happening, Multiverses is Back Somehow, something like that. You could probably search it up on my channel, or I'll leave a link or something if you want to see my thoughts originally. But the problem with this show especially is that a lot of the side characters are perfectly fine, other than a couple, which if you watch the show, you know who I'm talking about. It's just Akane and Ranma, the 2 main leads. I couldn't stand them, to be honest. They both kind of sucked, and it's in like a sort of understandable teenage way where they're constantly like misunderstanding each other and blah blah blah, but it's just frustrating to watch over and over. And there's also some episodes where it feels like the justification for them having this big fight are very thin, which is kind of because it's supposed to be a parody, right? And that happens in shonen all the time, where it'll just be like, now we're gonna have a fight with this character. But it doesn't make it good just because it's a parody. Also, I didn't mean to put this right above the original, but whatever, I did. In the remake, they do a pretty good job in redistributing, I guess, character moments so that it feels a lot more natural. I actually kind of like Akane and Ranma in this version. Trying to think what a good example would be. Actually, there's a good one in the most recent episodes. So there's a character called Shampoo who comes and is essentially trying to kill Ranma. But like halfway through, she follows like some weird Amazon code. So if a woman defeats her, she must kill her. But if a man defeats her, she must marry him. And of course, the whole gimmick of the show is Ranma turns into a girl when splashed with water. So Ranma ends up beating her as a girl originally, which causes her to come to try to kill him. And then he beats her as a man, and now she wants to marry him. So it's a weird, it's like a you lose-lose situation for him, right? Because he doesn't want that. Anyway, in the original, when Shampoo is sort of like lovey-dovey all over him because of this, whatever, presupposed idea that now he's her husband or whatever, Akane gets super jealous, and it feels weird because Ranma is, like, being very explicit about not wanting her attention and, like, get off of me and that kind of stuff. Whereas in this version, they do a great job of making him completely, like, stammering and, like, in shock about the situation to the point where you can understand Akane thinking that actually he does actually have feelings for her or whatever, and now it's actually a jealous situation that makes sense. That's the best thing I could say. Like, the motivations feel a lot more well fleshed out in this show for the main duo to keep fighting, which helps a lot to make them more likable, so it doesn't feel like they're fighting just because the plot needs them to, which, oh boy, there's another show on this list where that happens a lot. Anyway, it's pretty good. Alright, The Amazing Digital Circus. I still haven't watched episode 4 because when I'm recording this, it just came out a little bit ago. But, it's fine. It's like here, probably. Right now. To be fair, there's only 3 episodes I've seen, so. I was familiar with Gooseworks before this show. From Undertale remixes, because where else? And so I kind of knew what to expect a little bit in terms of like the style of humor and character design and stuff. I think episode 3 is definitely the best one so far. I didn't really care for episode 2 that much. I think episode 1 is fine. So it's very B tier for me right now. We'll see how it goes. It is very intriguing, so I can understand why it's very popular. And of course, indie animation, gotta support it, right? Anyway, next is Dungeon Meshi. I was convinced to watch this show, and the reason why I was not super into the idea of it originally was because it looks like generic fantasy, just sort of like plain fantasy, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't have any twists to it, necessarily. The twist is just that they eat the monsters, but not that there's something like else going on. There's just elves and dwarves and gnomes, and it's like D&D light. And I was just not very interested in it for that reason, because I don't know. Even something like Lord of the Rings, that's also very like default dark wizards are around fantasy, is extremely boring to me. I don't know why. It's just a genre that I've never really done well with. I've always found it a little odd. How much people can get into it, I don't know. Maybe I was just exposed to it too much when I was a kid. But the show is very good. Despite all of that, the show is very, very good. It's kind of interesting in that it's almost like a mystery every episode, how to defeat the enemy that they're faced with. Instead of them just being like, well, sometimes they do this. That's a basilisk. Here's how to defeat it. Sometimes they have to figure that out on their own, or some sort of improvisational way to defeat it, which does feel much more D&D-like than just like plain fantasy. And the twists of the dragon and all of that, which I'm sure most people already know, is pretty interesting. I think the setting up the way that the dungeon works as being something very what do I want to say? Smart. Let's just say smart. Is like a smart way to make the world feel more interesting. I think Senchi's backstory is the most interesting one, even though Senchi's the least interesting character to me. I like Laios, Chilchuk, and Marcel more than him, but I know a lot of people like him, so, you know. He does have the best backstory, I'll give you that. I think there is something a little refreshing with how frank the characters are to each other. It's not something you see all that much in just like a more serious, this isn't super serious, but more serious story. They're not trying to like play each other, but they're also not like in some sort of goofy camaraderie. Sometimes they'll just be like, I don't like you. I think you're bad. And it's like, oh, well, that's interesting. Anyway, there is one schemer character in the show, but it kind of works because he's the only one that is acting like that. It like most people aren't playing mind games, which I think is interesting. Anyway, Mob Psycho 100. This show is very good. This was another of my sister's recommendations. I have no interest in watching One Punch Man still. This is obviously by the same creator, at least originally. I think this one works for me a lot better because the premise is essentially that there's a bunch of other super powerful characters who are also psychics, and our main character is, of course, the most powerful psychic. And the idea isn't necessarily that, like, oh yeah, he can defeat them all in one punch, let's say, psychic punch, but he doesn't want to because it's boring or whatever. It's more so that he can defeat them all with one psychic punch, but he doesn't want to because he doesn't like fighting. And also, he thinks it would be bad to, like, you know, become some sort of a fighter with these powers. He just wants to use them to help people, which is interesting. There's a lot of parallels, actually, between these two that I could point out, but I'm not going to. I really like the ending of Season 1. The only thing that maybe keeps it from being, like, top tier for me is that the, like, first 5 episodes of the show are unendingly uninteresting to me. Where Mob is fighting, oh no, what's his face? The cactus hair guy. I don't remember his name. It's been a while. We watched this in, like, the summer. So, I think that arc is very boring to me. I was like, oh boy, I'm just not gonna like this show, am I? But I think when the actual, like, evil organization shows up and things actually start happening, that's when I got on board. And the first 2 episodes of Season 2 are also kind of slow and not that interesting, but then it picks up a lot more as it goes on. Although I still think Season 1's finale is better than Season 2's. And I haven't watched Season 3 yet, so don't spoil me. Thank you. Also, don't spoil me the Dungeon Meshi manga stuff either, because I haven't watched that, or read that. Okay. Now we're into superhero shows. X-Men 97 came out this year, which inspired me to watch a lot of X-Men shows, clearly. I couldn't get enough. And then, also Superman came out last year, or a couple years ago, but I just got to watching it now with the 2nd season, and Earth's Mightiest Heroes I've watched like 3 times now. But I just watched it again recently, so I can actually give accurate thoughts on it. So let's start with X-Men the Animated Series. This is a great show for its time. I do think it's a little hard to watch now in some specific ways. The animation is very interesting looking. And sometimes the stories will be very, like, plainly presented, I guess is the best way I can say that. But then other times you've got Magneto lamenting that the X-Men are going off to their deaths and saying, the bravest always die first. So it's definitely still got that, you know, X-Men spirit of having some deeper conversations about the world. I wouldn't really recommend it, though, in a lot of ways. I think if you want to watch this show, you might as well just watch X-Men 97, you know? I will say, though, the only character that feels like they're kind of underserved in the show from the main team is Jean. And that is not something a lot of the other shows can say, all right? Also, this show's got Gambit in a prominent role. And, right, this show's the only one other than 97 with real Rogue. I didn't know how much I disliked movie Rogue until I watched this show recently, and I was like, yeah, that just doesn't work. I thought like they were fine coexisting, but as soon as I watched this show, I was sold on the concept of comics accurate Rogue, the sort of Southern Belle with the power to fly and punch things really hard because she stole powers from Captain Marvel. It's important, okay? And we're going to see with some of these other X-Men adaptations, it's very important. Let's just talk about X-Men 97 first. It seems how it's a sequel, spiritual successor, whatever you want to say, to the original X-Men animated series. This show is so good. Literally, the only problem I have with it is that Life Death should have gotten more breathing time. It's such an important arc, especially because it's like the biggest thing Storm's doing in this season. And God, what are they doing with Storm half of the time? I don't understand, man. Anyway, Storm and Forge, I feel like there could have been... The way they adapted it, this is like the one adaptation of a story in the show that feels a little bit like it misses the point, kind of. But hey, it's still good. Well animated, and the adversary is a big upgrade from the comic version. Don't look up X-Men the Adversary from the comics. It's a wild one. Anyway, the rest of the show, episodes 1, 2, and then 6 to the end are some of the best X-Men television I've ever seen. And then Inferno and Life Death are still interesting. And I actually really like the space battle. Usually the cosmic side of X-Men isn't my favorite thing, because it feels just kind of like, it's a comic book, so we gotta have space stuff in there. But they actually did a pretty good job justifying it in this season. So I like that. And we're headed into the Age of Apocalypse next, so that should be good. Honestly, I think I'd put it just below... that's tough. Ooh. Okay, let's just say these are on the same level, okay? Personally, I feel like they kind of are. Well, yeah, I think I would leave Spider-Man with a slight edge, though. Just because... if I think of Spider-Man, I always think of Spectacular first at this point. Whereas I feel like this is just a really good adaptation of the X-Men. But when I think X-Men, I still think of the comics first. Anyway, let's talk about X-Men Evolution. This was the X-Men show I watched as a kid, which is partially the reason why Cyclops was my favorite X-Men character for a while. I wouldn't say he's my favorite now, but I still do like him. So again, thank goodness X-Men 97 came out. This show is an interesting premise, right? It's like we're going to take the X-Men and we're going to make them teenagers in a school, and then you're going to watch them grow up into adults, which it almost happens, and it's almost really interesting. A lot of people really like this version of Wolverine, and I can kind of agree, because he's basically Team Dad at that point, because obviously you can't age him down to a teenager. He's lived for 150 years or something. So he's kind of just the older mentor that works on cars and, all that stuff. So there's no Jean love triangle, except there still is, which is... there's no Jean love triangle with Wolverine. Instead, it's like a Scott love triangle with Rogue, who is probably the most baffling part of this show for me. I know a lot of people like this version of Rogue, and there definitely is some redeeming qualities to this sort of emo movie version of Rogue. They at least give her some screen time to be interesting. But But in the end, they just have to like sideline her most of the time because she'd be too overpowered. And she gets to use her powers like once or twice for some interesting situations, like when her and Scott get stranded in a mountain pass or whatever. I think the coolest part of this show is definitely when they mutants get revealed to the world, and there's like a question of like, can we even go back to the high school we've been hanging out at? Like, will they even allow us to graduate? And of course, their principal is Senator Kelly or whatever, who's the like mutant-hating senator from the comics. So there's a lot of like tension between like, will Scott and Jean get to graduate even though they put in all this effort? Jean gets kicked off her sports team because she's clearly been cheating because she has powers. And then like the jock bully character from the school setting turns into like an actual anti-mutant, I don't know what to call him, rioter, I guess, during the later events of the story. It's just interesting to see the progression of things as they slowly get closer and closer to like the X-Men canon that we kind of understand it to be. But this is probably the most boring Apocalypse story I've ever seen told in an X-Men media, X-Men property, other than, of course, the movie, which was like, ooh. But out of all of these shows that have Apocalypse in them, this one has to be the most like bizarre. Apocalypse barely does anything and barely says anything. He kind of just like floats around the globe and casts energy balls on pyramids. It's very odd. Also, the horsemen he gets in the show are insane. But also the scale tips the other way. They include some lesser known mutants like Mirage, who I quite like, although she doesn't get to be a Valkyrie, but whatever. It's fine. And they've got Boom Boom, which is an interesting choice. This show invented X-23 / Wolverine / Laura Kinney, which is crazy to me. It feels like that's such a natural idea. But hey, she's not really done that well in this show. I think her introductory episode is interesting, but I kind of wish she joined the team, you know? There's an episode of this show where they go... Who was the other one I was thinking? Oh, they go to an island, and Magma gets to do a bunch of stuff. It's pretty good. It's pretty good in a lot of ways, but also they're really bad at finales, is what I'll say. Magneto has a machine that reverses his aging and turns Scott into an action figure for a while. Yeah, it's really trying to be something interesting, and it feels like they're being held back just by, TV standards and all of that. But it's certainly better than Danny Phantom. I'd say it's better than Inuyasha. I'd say it's like here. Maybe here? We'll put it here. That feels about right. It's a pretty good show. I would recommend it. If you want to get into the X-Men, I think this is a good starting point, because you get to see, they do a pretty good job utilizing all of the X-Men, except Storm, who just gets to sit around most of the time. There's a whole dedicated sort of lead up and arc surrounding Beast. Oh, I forgot all about Spike. Oh god, I gotta talk about Spike now. Beast and Wolverine has this whole thing, of course. But Storm has one episode, and then the rest we're supposed to care about Spike, who is her nephew, who's an original character for the show. And honestly, his powers aren't even that bad. The show just doesn't know what to do with him. So then they just write him out of the show by making him go underground with the Morlocks. And then he comes back as a weird battle Borg bone monster guy. And it's what are we doing? Anyway, it does kind of feel like the show has a problem with Spike and Storm for some reason, which is very ironic for an X-Men show. Anyway, next we have Wolverine and the X-Men. This show is kind of a bizarre premise because they were mandated to make Wolverine the main character and lead the team, and they're in what world would Wolverine lead the team? Like, Scott has to be out of commission, Storm has to be out of commission, the Professor has to be out of commission, Jean also has to be out of commission. Like, that's like the chain of events that would have to happen to make it make sense. And they figure out a way to do it, and I really thought it was quite clever until like the last second when it was revealed that it's like, I don't want to spoil it, but it's something that we see a lot of in X-Men stories and adaptations, and I was like, oh, well, this is kind of boring. But at least they have the decency to throw a little bit of a twist into there. The show should really be called, and I saw people joking about this when I looked it up, Emma Frost and the X-Men, because it is a lot about Emma Frost, which makes sense, because everybody knows Wolverine, everybody knows Cyclops, everybody knows Storm. Emma Frost very rarely gets to do much of anything in these adaptations, even if she's included in them. And she's very interesting, even though she kind of just looks like your typical comic book female character a lot of the time, in the way that, like, you know, she's always wearing like skimpy outfits and all that. And she kind of feels like a knockoff Jean in the way that she's just like a telepath, but slightly less powerful. I promise she is very interesting. And they even go for the Emma Frost and Scott sort of like relationship thing, while Jean is quote unquote dead, which is how they, of course, break up the team. Jean and the Professor get like psychically blasted into some other location at the beginning of the show, which leads to a fracturing of the X-Men. And Wolverine has to pull them all back together, starting with Beast, and then we get Kitty and Iceman, and then we get Scott, who's like depressed in a hotel, and then eventually we get Storm, and then eventually we also have Nightcrawler. The problem is, like, really only Wolverine, Emma, and Cyclops matter, and the rest barely get to do anything. Like, in the first 4 episodes, 4 or 5, maybe 6, Iceman and Kitty feel like they're actually doing interesting stuff, and then after that, they're basically just background characters. It's kind of the same with Rogue, but at least Rogue gets to join. This is, again, movie Rogue, so she doesn't have the ability to fly or punch things really hard. She can only absorb powers, so she really doesn't have much to do, other than she joins the Brotherhood for a bit, and the show is a pretty good rendition of the Brotherhood. I miss Quicksilver, man, as a member of the Brotherhood. It's sad. And then we also have, of course, like Blob, Avalanche, and Bloodever. But we've also got Domino, which is very good because the show also covers like the future timeline of the X-Men, where Sentinels have taken over and all that. It's kind of like a Days of Future Past type deal, where the Professor is communicating with the X-Men from the future, where he got psychically zapped, basically. So Domino gets to show up in both timelines, and she is very interesting, and her relationship with Rogue is actually probably the most interesting relationship that Rogue has in the show, and then they just kind of like write her out of it eventually. It's like, what? No, I thought we were going somewhere with this. And unfortunately, Storm is even less well-served in this show than she is in Evolution, because she gets 1 episode to herself, and of course it is the Shadow King episode that is in every one of these shows, and I guess it's because it's the only time you can use Shadow King, and it gives the psychics something to do, but God, am I bored of the Storm episode being Shadow King every time. Anyway, after that, she has like a small like relationship thing with Angel right before he gets turned into Archangel, and then that's over anyway. And that's it. For someone who's like the second in command for the X-Men, basically, you really think she'd have more to do. And like one of the most powerful ones. But again, that's why they have to constantly sideline her, unfortunately. Nightcrawler goes on a expedition with it's a Genosha, which if you've watched 97, you know about Genosha, with Magneto and Scarlet Witch, which is very interesting. Overall, if I was to rank these shows based on only their Magnetos, I think obviously 97 has the best Magneto. But then it's probably this show, then animated series, then X-Men Evolution, where he just kind of feels like a generic cartoon villain. The show does a pretty good job being engaging. Honestly, the only episodes I was kind of bored with was one Shadow King. I already said that. But the Wolverine episodes with Wolverine's past were also very kind of like, okay, I've seen this a billion times sort of thing. But I think it's better than Evolution, personally, just because it's doing something different, but it also feels true to the comics a little bit more. I'm going to put it at the top of this tier. I think that makes sense. Actually, maybe I'll put it at the very bottom of A tier. And that's it for X-Men shows. So, obviously, 97 is my most recommended one of all of those if you want to watch one. However, I will say, if you just watch 97 and you want to watch another X-Men show, I would recommend Wolverine and the X-Men second. Because it feels like it's sort of in the same realm of, like, you know, Sentinels is the story, and, you know, you get to see all the hits. Plus, you get introduced to Emma Frost, who's probably going to be important in the second season of the show, given that they put a little bit of a spotlight on her. Okay. Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes. This is often praised as the best Avengers show, because it is. The problem is, it's still about the Avengers, and I personally do not like the Avengers. And I'm going to explain why. It's still better than... See, the thing with Inuyasha is it's got one really good arc. I think I said this last time. It's got one really good arc, but the rest of the show is just completely mid. So, I feel like I have to put it here. Here's the problem with the Avengers compared to the X-Men, right? The X-Men all come from different backgrounds. So, like, just going from this picture of Wolverine and the X-Men. Wolverine's like a war veteran. Scott was like a student who grew into the role. Storm was like a goddess, basically. Nightcrawler lived in a church and was kind of associated with that. Kitty Pryde is just like a teenager who went to school. Iceman's also kind of that. But like Beast is a scientist. Emma Frost is like a fashion model mixed with a sort of a secret society person. In the Avengers, Hulk is Bruce Banner is a scientist. Tony Stark is a scientist. Hank Pym is a scientist. Captain America is a soldier. Black Panther's a king. Thor's God, but he's also kind of like a prince. Hawkeye's just kind of a guy, and Janet is a model, basically, but she's also just kind of like the girl. It kind of feels like you've got like two sides of, and then Hulk is obviously just like a super strong thing. It's mostly just science experiments is basically what I'm saying. So it leads to a lot of things, especially when Bruce Banner is a bigger person in the story, which he's really not in Earth's Mightiest Heroes, where it feels like you're just kind of watching the same story over and over with different characters. And this was the thing, there were animated Avengers movies, and that's where I first saw the Avengers, and that's when I knew that I thought they were quite boring. Because it's just like too many overlapping character traits in terms of like who they are. And the real problem with Earth's Mightiest Heroes in the terms of its assemblage of the Avengers, because it's basically like the classic Avengers team, and then they throw in Captain Marvel, and leave out Black Widow. So I guess they kind of threw in Hawkeye. Is it feels like what it is, which back in the day was just smashing together the most popular or characters that they thought they had the most reason to be popular characters into one team without really considering the way that they would interact with each other, which is fine. That can be interesting. I think that having two scientists on the team, for example, isn't a bad thing as long as they're different enough that they can sort of butt heads about it. The problem is, it feels like Tony Stark and Hank Pym are more or less the same kind of guy. The only difference is that Stark is fine with having a battle suit, and Hank Pym would rather talk it out with criminals. In this version, that's like something they introduced for this version. I also think their handling of it is very funny, because they're like, yes, Ant-Man's a pacifist, and he thinks that we should be trying to reform criminals instead of just, putting them in super prisons. And it's like, okay, I wonder where they'll go with that. And where they go with that is that Hank Pym almost gets himself killed by a snake man. And then the rest of the team's like, pacifism's stupid. Now we have proof. And then he turns into Yellow Jacket and starts being violent. It's like, what? And the show does a decent job in trying to flesh out the relationships between the characters. The problem is it's just the same thing over and over because the characters are very similar. What's Iron Man and Thor's relationship? Oh, well, Thor thinks science or like machines are bad and magic is good. And Iron Man thinks machines are good and magic is just, it's science we don't understand yet. That typical kind of thing. What's Captain America and Iron Man's dynamic? Well, Captain America's from a time before technology had taken over everything. So he thinks that technology is blinding people to the truth. And Iron Man thinks technology is good, actually. You see what I mean? And it's like, well, what's Iron Man's relationship with Ant-Man? Kind of a similar deal. Iron Man's like, well, maybe you should do less science and, fight the good fight. And Ant-Man says, no, science is good and it can help us do good things. And what's Black Panther's relationship with the rest of the team? Can I ask you that? What do Black Panther and Thor think about each other? I don't know. I really don't. Really, the only person who gets decent relationships with most of the characters is Wasp, and that's because she's basically the point of view character, so that kind of makes sense. And that can make the show feel very flat, even though we're going and doing very interesting comic book arcs. Like, for example, this is probably the best adaptation of Secret Invasion, which recently got an MCU show, which also sucked. I should say, which sucked, because this one doesn't actually suck. But it could have been so much better if the characters actually had tighter connections, so it feels more impactful when they find out that one of them has been replaced by a Skrull. And, it's obviously one of the hearts of the team, so everybody has to, is fractured by them being different. I think they did, the best that they can with the Avengers. I just think the Avengers kind of suck, unfortunately. At least, the original iteration of them. I admit that I don't know what the current iteration in the comics of the Avengers looks like. But Iron Man, Ant-Man, and Bruce Banner all on the same team is my first thought to be like, this probably won't work that well. And Wasp. Wasp also does, some of the same stuff, but not quite as much, obviously. Because she's not really a scientist, but she hangs out with Hank enough that she's kind of related to the whole scientist thing. I will say, if you want to get an introduction to the Marvel Universe, I think the show is the best way to do that. Because they cover a lot of Thor stuff, which gets ignored by the MCU. They cover a lot of some classic Captain America stuff, which I think is quite interesting. Obviously, pretty much all of the Ant-Man stuff is completely different in the MCU. So that's something to look at. And this is still the best, I think, adaptation of the Hulk in anything, because they actually do have Bruce Banner and the Hulk talking. See, the problem isn't that Bruce Banner's a bad character. It's just we don't need Ant-Man on this team if we've got Bruce Banner. But you want Ant-Man because you want to explore Ant-Man stuff. But then, you're not going to kick Iron Man off the team, and you see where the problem is, right? So, yeah, I'm putting it here because it is a fun show. It just feels like it could have been really great if there was, maybe a little more thought put into how the characters relate to each other. There's never an episode where Thor and Captain America reminisce about, the past or something. I don't... yeah. Captain America never talks to Tony about weapons, manufacturing weapons for the military. I feel like that's such an easy thing to start with in one of these adaptations, is Tony has stopped manufacturing weapons for the military, and Captain America is literally a soldier. He's like, why would you stop, making weapons for the military? Aren't the military doing good things all around the globe? Well, Captain America, 70 years have passed or whatever, and things are different. Anyway. Are they really that different? I don't know. Superman My Adventures with Superman. That's what it's called. I was like, what is the subtitle? There is no subtitle. It's a pre-title. I like Superman, okay? I used to think Superman was boring when I was like 6. And then Man of Steel reinforced that for me. And then I actually watched a Superman movie, like a Superman animated movie. And I was like, oh, I get it. They're just doing it wrong. And it's kind of true. I don't hate people who like Man of Steel. I think Man of Steel is actually a pretty good movie. The problem is it's just like a bad Superman adaptation, and it has irreparably damaged the public's idea of what Superman should be. And this shows, it's more close to classic Superman, so I should really like it, right? Well, I think a lot of what this show does in reimagining Superman's lore for its own world is actually pretty interesting. Having Brainiac be this Kryptonian machine that has brainwashed Kara / Supergirl to continue conquering planets or whatever. The implication that the Kryptonians were kind of like a conquering race, an empire, is interesting. I think the relationship between Lois and Superman is actually quite well done. I think Jimmy feels pretty relevant a lot of the time when he's not just doing random side plots because they don't know what to do with him. And I think the actual Superman action is pretty good. The only problem is, why do all the villains suck ass? There's barely any Superman villains in the first season. I think Heatwave and Livewire are the only ones. Am I wrong about that? Because Intergang isn't necessarily Superman villains. They're called Intergang because they go across multiple cities and therefore they have to deal with multiple heroes. Although I guess Silver Banshee is more related with Superman than anybody else. This isn't really a... That's the problem. It's not really Silver Banshee, right? It's a character using a mech suit called Silver Banshee. I also am a person who doesn't like the Ultimate Universe's Rhino being a giant mech either. It feels wrong. Because if one person has the giant mech, then why doesn't everybody have the giant mech, right? You'd think if the Rhino in the Ultimate Spider-Man universe could create a giant Rhino mech, why don't more people create giant mechs? And the problem is, this Superman series thought about that and said, okay, if we're going to make Parasite, probably would be the first one they think about, a big mech, why don't more people become mechs because of that? And the problem is, if everybody becomes a mech, then it's not special anymore? Honestly, I don't understand. Was this... maybe it was some sort of mandate that they had to fulfill about redesigning the characters or something, so it's not confusing for people somehow. Studios think like that, Why would you want your characters to look more boring? I understand changing Livewire's design a little bit so there's not a giant lightning bolt running down her chest. I understand that. But why would you just give her brown pants and a off-white shirt and a vest and call it a day? Why not do something superhero looking? I don't know. It feels very weird. And then I don't really like Parasite as a big robot, even though the way it's done is probably the best out of the random characters they turned into giant robots. Because he's he looks straight out of Evangelion or something. It's very strange. I don't like what they did with Mr. Mxyzptlk being an anime, a generic anime sprite or whatever. Because kind of the point of the character is he's weird and off-putting, right? He's weird compared to the rest of the world. He's a tiny old man, but he's got universe-bending powers. Why then would you make him take a form in this world that is more fitting for this world that is like anime inspired. I don't know. That's a little weird. I do think it's interesting they're giving Superman like his electric powers from that brief run where he was an electric superhero. Real thing. But the biggest thing that kills this show for me in a lot of ways, and it doesn't kill the show, I still think the show is fun to watch, but the thing that makes me put it in low B tier is the fact that they get Lois and Clark together pretty early. So I'm like, oh, this is going to be a show where Lois and Clark are in a relationship. And we talk about the sort of like struggles that come with that. Kind of. It's a show where Lois and Clark are constantly debating whether they're in a relationship. It's like they think, I don't know, it's like CW kind of writing, where they think they have to end every episode on big stakes for the relationship. And it's like, you don't have to do that. They can have a stable relationship while like the superhero bad stuff is going on, and then have that get in the way of their relationship. That's fine. But like literally every episode is like, all right, they're happy and they've solved the relationship problems and they're back together. And then over the course of that episode, a new problem comes up. And then at the start of the next episode, that new problem boils over for the middle of the episode where they break up. And then the next episode, they get back together and they solve their problems. And then a new problem comes up, and then they break up, and then they get back together. And then they break up, and then they get back together. And they break up, and they get back together. Like every 2 episodes. And it makes them both seem stupid. Like they're children who can't talk to each other. I don't know. Also, why is Deathstroke here? I'm so confused what they're doing with Deathstroke. What do they want him to be? I don't get it. Anyway, it's still a good show, but I have a good amount of problems with it. To the point where I would consider putting it in C tier, if not for the fact that I think it's better than these shows. So maybe I should just move them all down. Yeah. The problem is I think this is probably better than this and this. The thing with Danny Phantom is it is completely stupid, but it is also ridiculously funny because of that. Unintentionally. Which is, I gotta give it its props for that. That feels more right, though, to me. I think. Which really sucks, because I want a good Superman, okay? I'm really excited for the movie. But I guess because I like Superman so much, that's why I'm so much harder on it, you know? If this was like I don't want to say a Batman show, because I also like Batman. A Green Lantern show with these kind of problems, I'd probably be like, yeah, this is like a high B tier. But Superman deserves better, okay? This is a step in the right direction, but we're not there yet. Anyway, last show of the year, it's Arcane. I'm only halfway through season 2 right now, but I mean, I couldn't not talk about it. I think this show is slightly overrated. Just slightly overrated. But I think it's because I come from the perspective that a lot of people watching this show do not come from, which is knowing who League of Legends characters are. When people say it's actually better if you go into the show without knowing anything about League of Legends, I thought they were saying like this is a prequel where like basically none of the gameplay or like stuff you see there is going to come into effect until way later. No, this show is very much like a drama show where characters die and it's supposed to be suspenseful, right? But it kind of ruins the suspense when you know which characters are in League of Legends. Because you're like, oh no, Echo and Jinx blew up on the bridge. Are they dead? Are they alive? Well, I know they're going to be alive because they've got to be alive for League of Legends. It kind of feels like the Star Wars prequel problem where it's like, oh man, I wonder if Anakin's going to survive this battle. And it's like, well, of course he's going to survive this battle. He has to become Darth Vader. Even though he gets cut in half or whatever by Obi-Wan, he'll be fine. Kind of. But I brought up the prequel specifically because it doesn't just feel like them in that some of the suspense is ruined by knowing the characters. It also feels like them in the way that Jace is just kind of Anakin Skywalker in a lot of ways. He's a starry-eyed idealist who wants to make the world a better place, who is constantly being misled by politicians. And it's very funny because my sister and I came up with a running joke that Jace's philosophy is literally just whatever the last person who talked to him is, or whatever the last person who talks to him said, which is, I think, pretty much true in a lot of cases. Like, for example, at the very beginning, Victor, his partner, is like, we're not going to use our magic technology to make weapons. And he's like, yes, we must use it only for the sake of making people's lives better. And then one of the politicians comes up and whispers in his ears, yes, but what if the weapons could make people's lives better? And he's like, maybe you're right. Maybe we should make weapons. And then he goes back and Victor's like, what are you doing? We're not making weapons. And he's like, right, because weapons would be bad. And then he goes and talks to Vi or whatever, and Vi's like, we gotta take Jinx down or things are gonna get worse. I need you to make me a weapon. He's like, okay, I guess I'll make you a weapon. And then he kills a child or whatever. That is pretty funny. But this show does politics way better than the prequels do, which is probably the best part of the show. Is like, it's kind of a political drama more than anything else. It's about how, like, the squabblings that are happening with Jinx and Silco and Vander and the corrupt cop and a Vi, I know her name, and Caitlin Lesser, but also there. At least in season 1. I guess she's more of a big deal in season 2. How those scuffles are constantly informing what the politicians want to do, and it's making them want to go harder and harder on suppressing the slums in the city. There are some parts, though, I feel like, that don't get enough focus, and those two parts specifically are Jinx in season 1 and Mel in season 1. And Mel gets a decent amount of focus, but I think the problem is we don't really get to understand her character until, like, the last episode. Which is kind of not great, because season 2 is kind of all about her relationship with her mother. So, it'd be nice if we got to, like, actually understand her more through Jace, maybe. Because for most of season 1, I thought she was straight up just manipulating Jace for her own gain and didn't care about him at all. And then at the end of the season, she's like, no, I have to protect Jace. I'm like, what? You care about him? I can't believe it. So that was kind of funny. Anyway, the problem with Jinx in season 1 is just that Silco's the big bad guy. And I think he's honestly very interesting as a character. I wasn't sold on him in the first, like, 3 episodes. Well, the first 3 episodes he was on screen, because he's not in, like, the first 2 of them, really. But once, like, Jinx got into the picture and their relationship was more explored, I was like, oh, he's very interesting, actually. Look at that. He's following the same path that his rival did. Ho, ho, ho. And then they call attention to that at the end of the season. And it's quite well done. The problem is that, like, anytime Jinx does anything, it's basically just to please him. And we don't really get that much of an exploration into Jinx's feelings about the situation very often. It kind of feels like we more often take Silco's perspective when we're dealing with Jinx than we do Jinx's perspective, which is weird because Silco is not a League of Legends character, at least not a playable one, right? And Jinx is. So we know that Jinx is more important than Silco. But we spend more time with Silco, which is fine, I guess, because that makes Silco way more interesting. And Jinx will probably have more time later. But in the stuff that I've watched so far, it feels weird that the whole story is about Jinx, more or less. It's about Vi wanting to reconnect with Jinx. It's about the upper city wanting to arrest Jinx for her explosive crimes. It's about Silco not wanting to give Jinx up, despite the fact that it would be the objective right thing to do for his crime business. But, like, Jinx herself doesn't have a stake in any of it, which could be interesting if we kind of focused on that more. But we don't really. She's just kind of hanging around watching Vi do stuff, or Silco do stuff. And I don't know. It feels kind of weird, especially now that we're in season 2, or I guess I'm in season 2. I guess we all are because season 3 hasn't come out yet. And now she's like a very important character that we're spending time with. And I don't care that much. I don't know. It's like the one part of the show that feels like there's something off there. Like even the Mel thing I mentioned earlier where like they could have spent more time on her. Now they are. It just would have been nice to have that in season 1. Seems how, it was kind of the setup for all of this. But don't let all my criticisms get in the way of the fact that this is a very, very good show. Sometimes they kind of just cheat character relationships. Like Vi and Caitlin got really close really fast. But you can kind of buy it because they saved each other from dying. And it is genuinely suspenseful if you end up liking any of the characters that don't have blue hair or a mystical weapon, right? Like there's a part in season 2 where you get introduced to these 2 police officers, and one of them's like this cheery red-haired girl, and I'm like, oh, they're so about to die, but then they didn't, and I was like, oh no, because that means they're going to be hanging around for longer before they probably die. And because I don't think either of them are League of Legends characters just by design. So, it is a very good show. And I would recommend you watch it if you're looking for something a little bit more self-serious, which is basically the reason why I wanted to watch it. Because a lot of these animated shows, they have a layer of humor to them, right? Where they're not taking themselves too seriously. Arcane is a show where they are taking themselves very seriously. Even the little fuzzy creature guy who's like 300 years old and is basically Yoda. Oh, also, hopefully they give Echo more to do in season 2. What the heck's up with that? Anyway, now I have to pick my best of the year, which is what S tier is for in this list. It was Avatar a couple years ago, and it was Batman the Animated Series last year. This year, it's only between shows I watched, and you'd think my pick would be Mob Psycho. But it's actually going to be Dungeon Meshi. Feels a little odd, but I think out of all the shows this year, Dungeon Meshi feels the most like, because it's not done yet. I'm not done Mob Psycho yet. X-Men 97 is obviously not done. Arcane I haven't finished yet either. Dungeon Meshi, I am extremely confident that the end of this show will be satisfying. I am extremely confident that I will really like it. Whereas with Mob Psycho, the 3rd season of the show could ruin everything. It's possible. Probably not going to happen, but it could. Because they've already kind of done the same plot in both seasons. So like if they do it again, that won't be very good. And X-Men 97, I mean, it had a good first season. But, I mean, there have been bad apocalypse stories before. They could mess it up. And Arcane, who knows how long this show is going to run. If it actually gets closer to the League of Legends era, it'll probably start being a lot less interesting. So that's my pick, is Dungeon Meshi. I don't think anybody will have any problems with that. I hope you've enjoyed this list, this hour we've spent together talking about cartoons and I guess one live action show based on a cartoon. And let me know your thoughts down below. What were your top 5 shows this year that you watched? And did I snub any show that you think is really, really, really good? Let me know, and I'll talk to you later. Thanks for watching. Bye!